All right, class, here today we're going to be talking about the 2000 election and then the September 11 attacks of 2001. Okay, so really focusing on the early years of the Bush presidency. So when we start looking at the 2000 election, we look at an election that it was very contentious, and obviously unlike any other election really we've seen since. All right, we've had similarities, but just the sheer chaos that ensued for weeks after the election, we haven't seen that, nor had we seen much of that in American history. So what happened in the 2000 election? Well, you had the Republican George W. Bush, the former governor of Texas and son of George H.W. Bush, president. And you had then Al Gore, the former senator of Tennessee, and then vice president under Bill Clinton. And so these two strong candidates representing their party were kind of locked into this battle. And the Gore campaign really did have the momentum through most of the summer of 2000. A good economy. People were pretty happy with the way things were going. And of course, Gore could run on that idea. Whereas the Bush campaign really kind of focused on this idea that there were some people who were still left out, some of the scandals of the Clinton administration, other types of things. And so as we got closer to Election Day, it became clear that there are about 3 states that really held the balance of what was going to happen early on. All right. As we move westward and more returns come in, there could be other states that came into play, but really Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida were the ones that people were looking at early on. And immediately, the first state that kind of falls is Pennsylvania to the Gore campaign. And so now Bush needs to win both Florida and Ohio, and the polls are really close there. He ends up winning Ohio, so now, all eyes of the country are on Florida. So what's going to happen in Florida? And what ends up happening in Florida is that early on they called it for Al Gore. And so it looked like Gore was going to win the presidency, be the next president. That there really was an electoral math in place where Bush could lose Florida and still win the election. All right. And so, that was pretty big for the Gore campaign. But as the returns kept coming in and the night progressed, Bush had the lead in Florida, and that was with 60% of the vote in, 65% of the vote in. Bush still had a lead, and so eventually the networks did something I've never seen them do. They pulled Florida off for Gore and said, well, it's now a toss-up. It's too close to call, which meant that the Bush campaign felt they still had an opportunity here, that something may come out that they could still win this. And in fact, they felt they had the votes in Florida, that they were going to win. All right, and so then as the night progressed, roughly around 11 o'clock at night, they called it for Bush, Bush had won Florida, which meant he was going to be the next president of the United States. He had now enough electoral votes that he was going to be the winner of the presidency. All right, and so there was talk that the Gore campaign was going to concede. And around 2:30 in the morning, the Gore campaign basically said, no, we're going to wait. We're going to see what happens. There's some discrepancy with some of the vote. The vote count by that point had gotten under 3,000 votes. That separated them. And so they were going to kind of see what tomorrow brought. I personally went to bed finally around 4:30 that night and got up at 5:30 for school. So I got myself like an hour and 15 minutes, I think, when it was all said and done. Because I was curious, how was this all going to play out? And the next day, still kind of waiting to see what's going to happen in Florida. Bush had the votes, but there was talk that, there's some discrepancies, particularly in southeast Florida, a couple of counties that, didn't quite seem to have the outcome that they thought they would. The Gore won them, but he didn't win by the margin that was anticipated. Now, of course, nationally, Gore had more votes than Bush. Gore was the popular vote winner. But of course, electorally, nobody had the votes yet because Florida was still a toss-up. Whoever won Florida would become the president. And so the Gore campaign decides that they want to have recounts done in those 3 counties in southern Florida. All right, Miami, Broward, and Dade. And so recounts began. And of course, these are very heavily Democratic areas. If there is votes to be had, they're going to be on the Democrat side. Okay? So what's going to happen here is that the vote will continue to shrink. And the Bush campaign is arguing that, well, these are not this is not the way that recounts should be done. They shouldn't just be done in 3 counties. You should do them statewide if you're going to do them. And there's no really reason to do the recounts in their minds. And so they are going to actually file a lawsuit against this that goes straight to the Supreme Court. All right, so, weeks have passed. We still don't have a winner. They're still doing recounts. The Supreme Court finally gets this case, Bush versus Gore, 2000, and in a 5-4 vote. So basically, the Republican-appointed judges will rule for Bush, while the Democrat-appointed judges will rule for Gore. And the decision basically comes down that the recounts need to stop. All right, that they, in essence, the idea was that you can't really change the election law in the midst of the election. Then you should have set this up prior to the election, and then you could have had the recounts done this way. But because you're not doing it as you have mandated it to be done, then you need to stop. All right. Now, of course, adding to all of the kind of chaos is the fact that the governor of Florida was Jeb Bush, the brother of George Bush. And so, the Democrats were feeling like maybe this was taken from them. Maybe if the recounts would have continued, Gore would have won. Or maybe if Jeb Bush wasn't the governor and a Democrat was the governor, that it would have been a more justified election in their mind. But of course, for all the negative publicity that Jeb Bush got during that time, there was no indication of any foul play or wrongdoing or trying to skew the outcome of the election. And, accountants went down to Florida after the election, and they did a number of different recounts. And the vast majority of those recounts, Bush still came out on top. And so, there's a more than likely assumption that the election results were the legitimate results that came out. But, a lot of people wanted to debate whether that was true or not. And so when Bush became president, there was really no mandate. He didn't win the popular vote, and there was questions about the legitimacy of his president from a large part of the population. And so, he will try to kind of reach across the aisle. He ran on this idea of compassionate conservatism, trying to soften the Republican image a little bit. But of course, that will be short-lived, because then in September of 2001, we have the terror attacks. And of course, this was a generational changing event. It obviously changed the presidency trajectory of George W. Bush. All right, he went from being pretty much a peacetime president to a war president for the rest of his, 7.5 years of presidency. And so the Al-Qaeda network, led by Osama bin Laden, had been plotting and planning attacks against the United States for years prior to September 11th. All right, obviously on a much smaller scale, but still, at one point, they did attack the World Trade Center. Before it was Al-Qaeda, it was still bin Laden and his group, if you will, looking to try to bring down the World Trade Center in 1993, unsuccessfully. The attack on the U.S. Embassy in Kenya and Tanzania, the attack on the USS Cole. There are a number of smaller terrorist attacks against U.S. positions and U.S. military from the late 90s into 2000, early 2001, which showed a signal of kind of an uptick of terrorist activity. And of course, then it culminated as far as the big event of September 11th, where hijackers took over a number of planes and then flew those planes into various targets. All right, so 4 planes in particular. 2 of them flew into both towers, the World Trade Center. A third one hit the Pentagon, and then a fourth one had made it as far east as Cleveland, as far west as Cleveland, before turning around, heading back towards D.C. It seemed like we weren't sure what the target is, because by that point, the passengers knew that hijackings had taken place, that planes were being used as missiles. And so Flight 93, United Flight 93, the passengers there decided they were going to just not wait. They were going to take matters in their own hands. They attacked the terrorists. The terrorists put the plane into a dive that was unable to be brought out, and the plane crashed over Shanksburg, Pennsylvania. And so we don't know where it was, but obviously the heroes on that plane helped save probably more lives by their actions. But of course, the image of September 11th is the big hole in the Pentagon, and then of course the towers coming down. And most anybody who was aware of what was going on and watching what was happening that day can give you a very vivid description of every detail that was going on September 11th. The beautiful sky here in Ohio of that morning, a beautiful kind of pre-fall day. And of course the same in New York. And then just the tragedy and sadness of what was to transpire as the towers came down with the loss of life and the destruction and everything else. And of course we knew that this was mind-changing, this was game-changing, this was going to be much a different world the next day. And as we kind of cleaned up what was going on in New York, we began to realize, of course, that we can't just let this happen. We're going to have to respond in some way. And so the fact that Al-Qaeda had claimed responsibility, that Osama bin Laden had kind of masterminded this, of course, the idea was, well, we were going to go find them and we're going to make them pay for what had happened. And so they were training in Afghanistan, and so that became the focal point. So September 11th, the attacks occur. It will not be until October of 2001 when we launch an attack on Afghanistan to find bin Laden and to get rid of the Taliban. The Taliban were the kind of the governing crew of Afghanistan who allowed Al-Qaeda to come in. And this is where we begin to hear the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine, the idea that any terrorist group, any nation that harbors terrorism is a terrorist nation. And so we went after the Taliban in Afghanistan, quickly kind of getting them out of power and trying to institute new government there. And then, of course, trying to find Osama bin Laden, which the Bush administration did unsuccessfully. He was unable to do that. Bin Laden will eventually be captured during the Obama presidency, but we'll talk about that another time. Then, of course, that was the first part of the War on Terror. The second part of the War on Terror was the attack on Iraq. All right, so the United States in 2003 decided to invade Iraq for regime change. We wanted to get Saddam Hussein out. Now, it wasn't because we had connected Saddam Hussein to the September 11th attack. That was not what our government was telling us. But what our government was telling us was that there may be chemical weapons in Iraq. And if terrorists get chemical weapons, they may try to use them on Americans. And in this age of terrorism, we can't allow a terrorist organization to obtain those weapons. So we need to get Saddam out, get new leadership in, and find those chemical weapons and potentially nuclear weapons. We said